All right, so we've been talking about random stuff like arbiters calling flags and the 50 move rule and stuff. But um, anyway, at this point, you're joining us where I'm about to talk about the Maroczy bind. I was just mentioning that Carlsen played it in his final game against Karyakin in the World Championship match. Um, Now, to kind of illustrate the power of it, it's good to look at statistics. Let's see, is this the right place to look at it? Sure. Okay. So, we're kind of starting in on the Maroczy bind here. And notice the numbers for white. Notice how 41%, 40%, 30%. I mean, basically white scores anywhere from 35 to 40% here, which is really unusual for an opening. If you look at most openings, you'd be lucky if you get 30, 33%. So you'll notice white scores a very, very healthy percentage of wins and relatively low percentage of losses too. And in fact, 50 or 60 years ago, people thought that allowing the Maroczy bind was basically tantamount to positional blunder. They thought it was basically just horrible. There's also some interesting history. I mean, I didn't do serious research. I looked at Wikipedia, chessgames.com for this, but Maroczy is white. I actually couldn't find a single game where he had played it as white. Kind of interesting. Apparently, it's named after him because he heavily criticized in his annotations of, he'd annotated one of the games of, I don't recall who was white. I think it was Tarrasch or something like that, where white did not play c4 in the opening, and he was like, you're an idiot. You should just play c4 and you're going to be winning, So I guess it's named after him for that reason. And curiously enough, you could actually find Maroczy playing the black side of the Maroczy bind in a few games. So anyway, that's just some brief historical background.
The bind, the version of the word bind refers to the d5 square.
Yeah, and getting into the actual opening, well, I'm going to do that later. First, I want to cover something else. But, I definitely want you guys to know that understanding the Maroczy bind and playing it with white, it's a very important thing for you guys to learn. Even if you don't think it's your cup of tea, sometimes it's just simply the best option. So you guys really should learn to understand this position. Okay, so let's go back. Put that on pause for a minute. We first need to look at the Rossolimo. And I'm covering the Rossolimo as a way of kind of completing a anti-Sicilian repertoire. Because we've been looking at the Moscow variation and alternatives against 2e6 to 3d4. So to complete that, we need to look at bishop b5 against knight c6. Because d4 would be like a regular open Sicilian. And the whole point of playing an anti-Sicilian is you want to avoid the gobs of theory that you're going to have to understand and know to play it, right? Okay, so bishop b5. And black basically has two main moves here. There is a third option, which is d6, but we actually covered that in the Moscow. So if you want to know how to play against d6, just reference that study. G6 is probably the most testing move, and it's also the most common. It's ambitious. Black wants to play bishop g7, control d4, and just kind of asks you to take on c6. And I think it's basically best to take on c6 right away. Already black has a choice. D takes c6 is the better one. It's pretty similar to like an exchange Ruy Lopez. If you guys are familiar with Ruy Lopez, white's first three moves are actually exactly the same. And like in those lines, black should take the d pawn for a couple of reasons. One is to make development easier, since when you play d takes c6, you can develop your bishop on c8 without having moved another pawn. It also gives you greater control over the d4 square, so black has better control over the center. So there's some good reasons to take with the d pawn, even though it's away from the center. All right. So d3. Generally speaking, in these positions, white is not going to aim for d4. Can someone explain why d4 would, just generally speaking, not be a good idea?
Because it's already controlled by a pawn, a queen, and maybe the bishop on g7.
Well, I'm not sure. There's no tactical reason or anything, if that's what you're implying. I mean,
Well,
white can play d4 here, but it's just not good.
Fix your double pawns.
In
Exactly. That's one of the big things is if you play d4, you're going to undouble black's pawns. So, part of the reason you're parting with your bishop is to permanently mess up those pawns. So, to play d4 doesn't make sense. And the other reason, another general principle, is black has the two bishops. So you don't want to open up the position here. All right. So you're always going to be playing d3 here. Now bishop g7 and h3. H3 is useful because, believe it or not, the bishop on c8 is a big problem piece for black in this line. Good to remember that. Because the bishop doesn't really have any good squares or targets. The bishop on g7 is useful enough, protecting d4, has a nice diagonal. Later on, black's going to want to play e5, by the way, so it will protect that pawn. So it has some use, but the bishop on c8 is a problem piece for black. So something to keep in mind, if you're playing black in these positions, if you can find a good spot for that bishop or exchange it, it's going to be nice. Now you may wonder why white plays d3 first and then h3. You could play h3 first if you wanted to stop it, but bishop g4 isn't so special right now because white can play knight bd2, and after h3, just replace it with the other knight. White wants a knight on f3 to control e5 and d4, and not really the queen. So we play h3 so that we can, after knight f6, put knight on c3. And knight on c3 doesn't block the bishop on c1. It's pretty simple. All right, now castles, bishop e3, b6, and queen d2. So white doesn't have to castle queenside in these positions, by the way, but I think it's the best way to play for a win. White can castle kingside and hope for some long-term pressure that way, but I think going for a kingside attack is actually the best thing you can do here. And if you play the Yugoslav attack as white against the dragon, white's idea is probably pretty familiar, right? You want to exchange bishops on h6, bishop h6, and weaken the black king. Okay, now e5. This is an important idea for black to get space on the king side. There's a tactical reason black can play this, and it's worth remembering. If white were to take on e5 here, black has knight takes e4 and gets the pawn back. So it's a very important idea. If you're playing black, you should remember. And by the way, if black doesn't play e5, white can still go forward with the same plans as bishop h6.
Warren, if instead knight takes e5, knight takes e4, and then knight takes c6.
Ah, desperado. Okay, what's happening here? Does look interesting. If knight takes d2, knight takes d8 seems okay for black.
Is this even, or is this slightly better for black?
I imagine black has to be doing well. I just don't know how.
Can't black take back with the rook?
You mean after? Well, if you take back with the rook here, king takes. White looks to be a pawn, right?
Right.
I'm thinking maybe bishop takes c3.
And b takes c3.
Yeah, b takes, and what now? Maybe queen e8, and if takes, queen takes c6. And yes, white is up a pawn, but I think black is actually,
Yeah, I don't know that white's going to be able to hold on to it.
yeah, something like f5, and white should be no worse, but neither should black, I don't think. Yeah, I don't think this is very good for white. The opposite colored bishops make the extra pawn not very valuable. Okay. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe Stockfish has a different idea. Always good to check with the engine. So Stockfish, okay, wants knight c4. I guess I think black has plenty of compensation here. Bishop f5, just attacking c2.
Okay.
Yeah, this is better than I realized. Problem is the knight can't really move easily because of b2.
Right. I mean, you castle the queen side, though. Or you can't. You can't castle the queen side.
So, okay. All right, well, I'm glad we looked at that, though. But in any case, generally speaking, white can't take the pawn because of that discovery. So bishop h6. Now it's a serious threat to take on g7, take on e5. So black has to guard d6. And yeah, we're going to look at an example actually. Black can play queen d6 or rook e8. Either are okay. So let's look at an example. And this is a really recent one, by the way. This is from the current FIDE Grand Prix tournament going on. And I just happened to come across this game. So this was a very interesting one. So again, d3 and h3. And here he puts his bishop on f4. Slightly different, but it eventually amounts to the same thing. White ends up eventually getting that dark squared bishop. And this is a plan we're going to see later. White wants to get this knight to g4. It may look kind of bizarre, but we're helping to migrate pieces to better squares on the king side. And that knight on c3 is going to move around to e2 later too. And the main point right away is that white can move the queen and castle. The knight migrates over.
Wait, how come? Why did black push that a pawn one? To
It's just an attack on the queen side.
destroy.
Yeah, I guess I thought it went without mentioning, but I shouldn't assume that. Since both kings are castled on opposite wings, typical reaction is a pawn storm, right? Especially since black has 4 pawns to 3. It's pretty sensible idea. So white's preparing f4. And now a3. That's a useful idea for black to remember in not only this position, but just in general. It may look counterintuitive because after b3, you can no longer open up the queen side. But the point is, white's going to have this permanent issue with king safety, since the threat of black in some case getting a queen to b2 is pretty lethal. So it's a very interesting idea. So white's working on his own pawn storm. So white's managed to exchange dark square bishop. And by the way, queen b2 mate is being threatened. Now here Adams makes a tactical error. Knight c4, interestingly enough, was very good. The point is if b5, bishop e5, attacking the queen. But nonetheless, it was only slightly better. Knight d1 is fine. And this is a very nice exchange sacrifice. Adams did find this one. And point right away is bishop e5, but long term, black's king is just weak. And Adams kind of starts to go astray. He allows black to yet again get that queen on the long diagonal. He should have played f4, and white more or less has pretty killer position. Bishop takes g4 doesn't work out for tactical reasons because of rook g1. And meanwhile, we see that, remember how I talked earlier about the bishop c8 being a problem piece for black? Notice how it still doesn't really have any active place to go to. So white has a pretty simple plan of bringing the knight from d1 into the game, and there's not really a whole lot black can work on here. But I think this was a tactical problem. I think after
Push pawn, can't bishop on c8 take pawn?
Oh, I was saying for tactical reasons, it's kind of dangerous because of rook g1.
Oh.
And yes, you can play h5, but after knight f2, the g file is going to be opened, and that's not good news for the black king. All right, so rook h1, and it was tactical error because now rook f3 and queen e5, and white's okay here, but again, the problem with this b2 square is pretty evident, right? So the king is just really weak. And they agreed to a draw here. Either side could have tried to play this out more. White has the better pawn structure. However, that advanced pawn at a3 still causes some problems. In some case, a black rook in the endgame could get on the back rank and play rook a1 or something. But I guess they just called it a draw.
You can move black bishop can move to G.
Well, you definitely wouldn't want to play bishop g4 because then rook g5 would be the fork, right? I mean, I think black should play either b6 or g4, and he's fine. So anyway, the main thing in this game was keeping in mind the maneuvers that white played. Getting the knight to g4 and playing knight e2, queen d2, playing for f4. Those are important ideas. And this was an unusual case where the knight went through e5. Typically, you'll actually go knight h2 and then knight g4. So either way works fine. All right. And here we have another example. This was with bishop e3. And this time, Caruana castled kingside. Again, I prefer the queen d2 method, but castling kingside is fine.
So Carson is right. Black.
Yeah, Carlsen is black.
Does
And
Carl want to like minimize the lead in the
well, he's number 3 in the world, I think, right now.
Oh, he's
Yeah, I think So is number 2 right now.
so.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it depends on what rating system we're going on. If you go on the universal chess rating system, it might be different, but that's a different story.
Is it like not reliable if you go on the universal?
What's that?
Is it like not reliable if you go on the universal one?
It just doesn't, it doesn't really matter all that much whether you're second or third in the world.
Yeah, the only thing you really, I mean, yeah, the only thing you need to know is like Carlsen is pretty much easily the best. The rest is kind of a jumble, kind of changing constantly.
Hasn't Nakamura like fallen off a little?
Not really, actually. Just other people have gotten better.
Yeah.
I don't think Nakamura's gotten worse. In any case, let's try to stay on topic here. So castling is fine for white, like I was saying, but this game kind of serves as the reason I recommend castling queenside. So let's take a look.
Why did he play queen d1?
Yeah, queen b1 may look very bizarre. White wants to attack on the queen side with b4 and create weaknesses. So since white can't have a successful kingside attack right now, he's just going to play on the queen side. I mean, I don't think this is the best plan, but it is the idea. Now, by the way, black doesn't take on b4 here because after a takes, the queen side's actually under some decent pressure. White already threatens moves like bishop takes b6, and the white rook in a1 is just clearly better than this black rook in a8. So he avoids doing this. And besides, white has this positional threat too of playing b5, gaining the d5 square for the knight. What's that? Yeah. But instead, Carlsen played this more interesting idea of getting basically a King's Indian-like position by sacrificing a pawn, and it is very nice. So even though white's pawn structure is way better, a simple attack on the king side with g5, g4 is rather hard to stop. So it's basically like a dream King's Indian for black, since black's high square bishop has no opponent. And the tactics work out pretty nicely here. Queen e7.
These three queens.
So Caruana does manage to trade queens. However, the difference in minor pieces is pretty stark. Bishop on g7 is way better than that knight on a4. And notice that Carlsen doesn't even bother taking it. And white resigned. White basically hardly has any useful moves. Black intends maybe just rook e3 and f2, and 2 passers is pretty hard to stop. So I included this kind of be fair to the black side, show some plans for black, and also why I prefer the line where white castles queenside. All right. So let's look at one more example here. So this time we're going to see the move order that I was looking for with bishop e3, not bishop f4, and castling queenside.
Stevens games.
Yeah, this was not Stephen Wells. This was Peter Wells, the English grandmaster.
How come they still haven't traded the bishop? The bishops have been just sitting there for a while.
Yeah, neither side wants to take. Well, okay, white can take here and it's okay, but keeping that tension's really useful.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And black doesn't want to take because you don't want the queen on h6. That's very, very bad.
And you don't want to lose your
Yeah, I mean, to put it more simply, does taking on g7 improve your position?
Not really.
Yeah. So I think that's all it is. What's that?
Why waste time?
You mean white?
Why waste time?
Oh, yeah, basically. I mean, in knight g4 is more pertinent trying to open up the h file. Of course, now it would be suicide for black to play something like knight takes, because now bishop g7 and queen h6 is a serious threat. And the bishop's not running away since bishop h8 would lose the exchange. So, okay, so knight h5. Now white actually does need to take on g7 because we can't go back to e3 because we lose the bishop. And we can't move the knight because now the queen attacks it as well. So now we trade and go back to h2. So black's actually doing okay here, but the problem black has is this knight on e4 and the weak pawn structure. It makes it pretty hard to play his position. Queen c3, by the way, threatening queen takes d4. Knight takes b3 runs into rook takes e5. By the way, rook e5, the whole point is queen e5, rook f8.
Why isn't the rook allowed to take them? Because you took queen. Take.
Well, it's allowed to take, but, oops, sorry. But, white wins the queen and the knight, right?
Oh, I didn't see that. Oh yeah, if it wasn't checked, then technically he loses the trade.
And black resigns. You have king h7, rook h5, and black loses a lot of material. Queen h6, take, queen d6, take the knight. Yeah, again, the main thing to remember here, though, is what to do after you achieve bishop h6. And keep in mind this knight h2, knight g4 idea. You might get stuck of how to improve your position without it. So it's really important to play that. Okay, so this was all I had on d takes c6. Do you guys have any questions on this line? I've tried to outline a pretty simple plan. Remember, with white, you want to play d3, h3, knight c3, bishop e3, queen d2, castle, queenside. And later on, how you improve your position is with this knight h2 move, followed by knight g4, and try to open up the king side. All right. So now let's look at the other option where black takes with the b pawn. It's not necessarily just completely harmless. So let's take a look. Castle and rook e1, and now c3. So this plan should be familiar to you from the last time we looked at the Moscow, right? A lot of times white was trying to play c3 and d4, and it's the same story here. One of the things I really like about this game is one of the ideas it illustrates too. Bishop g4. Bishop g4 was a mistake, but e5 wouldn't have really been any different. White would have had the same plan. So bishop g4, white gets the bishop. And now a3. So in fighting against this pawn structure, it's important to remember this idea of wanting to play b4. The whole point is you want to undermine black's control over d4 so that you can later play it yourself. It's an important idea. And black could have taken on b4, but after a takes, white just has a much more pleasant position. The a file is very nice, and white is going to attempt to play knight a3, maybe knight c4, bishop b2, d4. with a nice position. Carlsen really plays some beautiful tactics here. So knight f3, threatening bishop d2. And now bishop b4. This is a cool move. And even though in the resulting endgame white's down a pawn, black has to return it. Since both a7 is threatened and the knight, and we can't play knight c8 because of this pin on the knight by the bishop. Now white wins a7, and simply put, the path white a pawn is stronger than black c pawn on c6. Now white gets a pass c pawn with some tactics. And now it's just a winning game. Okay. And black resigns because if rook takes c6, we just trade all the pieces. And with 3 pawns to 1, it's just a pretty trivial win. But the main reason I included this again was to illustrate this a3 and b4 idea. So this is important to remember. And if black doesn't play e5, then you'll just play d4 yourself, and you'll have a large pawn center, and black doesn't have an easy way of dissolving it. All right. So any questions on this line with either b takes or d takes e6? Okay. So now let's take a quick look at e6. So e6 is the other idea, and it's kind of tricky. It's important for white to castle here, because black's idea is to play knight ge7, and then a6, and you're going to be forced to basically part with the bishop if you're not careful. Okay, now castle, knight e7, and rook e1. Now you want to play rook e1 so that you can play bishop f1, making room for the bishop. Whoops, I skipped ahead. So after a6, bishop f1, and d4. And so I highlighted the pawns here. White's advantage is small because black doesn't really have any bad pieces or weaknesses, but in the long term, we have 3 against 2 on the queen side, so white has a better chance of getting an outside passed pawn. It's much easier for white to create a passed pawn here than black. The 4 on 3 on the king side could be good for an attack, but the endgame is almost always going to be difficult for black because white can make a passed pawn. So just to show you, let's look at a nice game between Carlsen and Gelfand. This was from the candidates back in 2013. Okay. So bishop e5, e6, castle, rook e1, bishop f1. Carlsen is white. Gelfand is black. Rook d3, by the way, pretty cool move, threatening just knight d5. And queen b2, of course, is bad for the same reason. This time because of the bishop discovery. And b4 may look scary, but you can't take on b4 because of bishop f6. And now Carlsen found a very nice move here, queen a5. Exploiting the fact that if rook a5, rook d8 leads to mate. So now white just has this useful queenside majority, and black's kingside majority is just not as useful. And finally, black resigns. There's no way to stop b8 queen. So it may have seemed cryptic before when I mentioned, white's queenside majority gives you good endgame chances, but I hope this game, helps you understand why. And I definitely recommend you play through the game too. There's nice tactics, some nice strategy here. I just don't want to cover them today. So this was a really cool game. Okay. Oh, whoops, did I mix this one up? Oh, no, there's another. Oh, yeah, sorry. this belonged in the other line with b takes c6. I wanted to show what happened if, oh wait, no, we already covered this game. It's in the wrong section. Okay, sorry, got myself mixed up. All right, so let's take a look at another example from this line. Knight d4. This is a common move you may encounter, but generally speaking, knight d4 is a mistake if white has not played knight c3. And it's just because there's no tempo black gets on the knight on c3. So not getting that tempo makes it not as useful. But let's see how white plays anyway. d3 and knight d2. And the knight's going to be a lot more useful. When you move the knight to c3, it's harder to get it to a good square like f3. You get to play like knight b1 back, just losing a full tempi. But this time we can play knight d2 f3 without any loss of tempo. And here's a tactic worth remembering in this position. It may look like white's losing light squared bishop, but we have this cute move, bishop d5. Point being, if e takes, check, and d6. And this pin is going to be a huge problem for black. Black can't even castle, by the way, because then de7 wins a rook. So very nasty. So bishop d5, a nice idea, avoiding losing the bishop. And now knight f3 highlights the weakness of the d4 pawn. And at this point, white's just clearly better. And white's much better in this game. We don't need to look at it, but it's instructive to see how he wins. This game is a great example, by the way, of why people say, bishop is better than knight in the endgame if there are pawns on both sides. And this is pretty much a perfect example of that. Okay. So let's finally look at the Maroczy bind a little more. Okay. And by the way, there are some move order details here. You'll notice that white's playing c4 on move 3 here. That's for a reason. g6 can be a clever move order to try to get a regular dragon. And the point is, after d4, c takes, black can play knight f6. It's annoying for white since you can't play e5 because we have this typical queen a5 check idea to win the pawn. And if we play knight c3, black can play d6. And now we've just transposed a regular dragon, and black's avoided allowing the Moscow variation. So if we're trying to play an anti-Sicilian, this doesn't really work. So that's why it's important to play c4 first. And now if knight f6, we can play knight c3. Then we can play d4, and we have the pawn pair on c4 and e4. By the way, just a note, instead of g6 on knight c6, you might think, why not just play c4 here if the Maroczy bind is so great? But there's a problem. What can black do here? Well, if that's the case, then we shouldn't even bother with the Rossolimo, right? So I'm asking what black can do here. Yeah, e5. So now we can't play d4, right? And, of course, white's okay, but it's actually somewhat inconvenient that white's played knight f3, since typically in these positions you want to be able to play f4, right? So, yeah, black really has no issues here. So we don't want to allow black to just close a position like that. So that's why against knight c6, you should play the Rossolimo if you want to play an anti-Sicilian. And after g6, you want to play c4 to avoid that knight f6, d6 idea that I mentioned. So now bishop g7, d4, c takes, knight takes. Now let's take a look at where your pieces will usually go in the Maroczy bind. Now there are some other plans, but this is the main one that you'll employ. So your bishops go on e3 and e2. Note that. Bishop on e2 is important to control the g4 square. And also by putting it on e2, you keep connection with the d4 square. So it's just overall the right square. And besides, if you put the bishop on d3, a future knight e5 would just harass it. So your bishop belongs on e2 and your other one on e3. And you almost always castle king side of the Maroczy bind There are some exceptions, but since you played c2, c4, your king would usually be weaker on the queen side. So almost always you're going to castle king side. And now f3. F3 is the most solid way of playing. You're just safeguarding e4 so that your knight can play knight d5 in the future, and so it's not tied to it. F3 also guards a g4 square, so you can play queen d2 without having to worry about knight g4, right? So this is kind of similar to Yugoslav, except that we're not trying to play g2, g4 for an attack. We're just trying to guard e4 and g4. Whoops. Now, sometimes white can play f4, but typically not when black fianchettos a bishop like that. Okay. Queen goes to d2. d2 is almost always right square for the queen. It connects the rooks, and the d file is usually the safest spot. If you put it on c2, you'd be subject to a possible x-ray attack from the rook. b3, you'd be subject to knight a5 attacks. And on a4, of course, you'd be setting yourself up for discovery. So d2 is almost always just the right square for the queen. By the way, I'm not trying to play the best moves for black. I'm just trying to illustrate the plans for white here. And now there's two ways you can situate your rooks in Maroczy bind with this f3 structure. You can play rook ac1 and rook fd1, which is what I did here. Or you can play rook fc1 and rook ab1. So both sides have their merits. When you play rook fc1 and rook ab1, let's just say, for example, this, you're hinting at expanding on the queen side with maybe a future b4, a3, or a4 and b5. When you play rook ac1 and rook fd1, you're playing more of a waiting strategy. You're hoping maybe play knight d5 in the future and get a favorable endgame. So slightly different plans. They're both good. Okay. And then finally we see b3. So generally speaking as white, you're going to have this c4, b3, a2 on the queen side, and f3 and e4 on the king side. You're kind of making this kind of V structure pointing towards the center. b3 is almost always a very useful move in this line because you're just guarding c4, providing overprotection, so that when black plays like a knight e5 move, the pawn's going to be well defended. So generally speaking, that's going to be where you put your pieces, and that's what your pawn structure is going to look like. Okay. Now there's some positional themes. Avoiding exchanges. So let's take a look at your typical Maroczy bind. So knight takes d4 is a common idea you'll face as black. The downside of black playing that is you lessen your already kind of limited winning chances. But the idea behind it is black wants to exchange dark-squared bishops. So there's another positional theme. If black can exchange dark-squared bishops in the Maroczy bind, generally speaking, he's going to be fine, actually. Because of white's idea to play pawns on e4, b3, c4, f3, they're all going to be on light squares. So the dark squares are going to be kind of weak for white. So if black can exchange one of those dark square pieces, you're going to be happy. So it's very important in these positions to play bishop e3. I mentioned this because it might be counterintuitive, right? You might be thinking that you're still in some kind of Yugoslav attack or something where exchanging bishops will help you, but it's not the case here. You really want to keep dark squared bishops on. So keep that in mind. You don't want to exchange that pair of minor pieces. And I included this Carlsen game with Mamedov to show you white's play here. So knight d7, and now bishop d3. Again, really important. You also want to prevent black from exchanging queens. Generally speaking, every piece exchange helps black's position because black has less space, right? We've talked about that before. And the other idea black has is, let's say you play like rook fd1 here. That'd be careless because black could take in d4 and play queen b6. And now black has basically absolutely no problems. You can go into the endgame, but he's going to be just fine. So it's important to remember this bishop e3 move to keep black from exchanging dark squared bishops. And in this case, Carlsen played the rooks to c1 and b1. And I think it makes more sense here since now a4 is presented because b4 win a piece, right? This is another thing. In the Maroczy bind, patience is a huge virtue. King h1 is not exactly a spectacular move. It doesn't really threaten anything. But since white's not under threat, it's good to just pass the move to your opponent and let them destroy themselves, make them play a bad move. Because it's really not easy to see how black can improve his position here. So it's good to let your opponent stew and find a way to weaken their position or just simply blunder. So definitely learn in the Maroczy bind to make kind of non-moves. Let your opponent kind of find ways to strangle themselves. It's a very useful skill. So h5. So already it kind of pays dividends. H5 doesn't really serve any purpose except to just weaken black's king here. So already his strategy is kind of working. Now rook c2, another kind of just, here's a move. Bishop f1, same thing. Now a3. Now he kind of hints at a actual productive plan. He wants to play b4. And black then has to be careful about losing a piece. Since the knight can't go to d7 because you play b5, right? So this is another point. One of black's ideas is actually to play f5 in Maroczy bind. You generally have two breaks, either b5 or f5. Without those, you're never going to be able to get rid of white's bind on the light squares, right? So c4 and e4 control d5, so you've got to get rid of one or both of them. So those are breaks that black is going to be looking to play. The problem for black in this position is that f5 just weakens his king a great deal. See, now bishop d4 actually is a favorable exchange since the black king would be weakened with fewer pieces to protect it. Now black loses the pawn. And black resign. That pin on the a file is basically lethal. So anyway, I think this is a really nice game illustrating white's ideas here. So number one, you want to avoid the exchange of pieces early on, especially dark squared bishops. And number two, don't be afraid to just make pass moves. Once black has no threat to your position, once you got your rooks ideally placed, play moves like king h1, bishop f1. You saw rook c2 as well. Just kind of let black, weaken their position. And if they don't, then you can try to come up with a productive plan, like Carlsen did with a3 and b4. All right. Now, since we're on the theme of avoiding exchanges, I also like this knight c2 idea. Now, there are some tricks you need to know to play it tactically, but I think it's a really nice idea. So before we're looking at moves like bishop e3 here to defend the knight, but knight c2 is a nice possibility too. The idea is just simple, like we were saying before. Since black has less space, you want to avoid exchanges. Oh my gosh, I did not mean to go long way again. Okay. Now d6, but you should beware. So white played bishop e2 here, which is good, but you should understand why knight c3 is not good. What do you think? What do you think black would play against knight c3? Yeah, exactly. And even though black's parting with that really valuable dark squared bishop, this long-term weaknesses of those double c pawns is a serious problem for white. And after something like knight f6, black will later play b6, bishop a6, knight e5. c4 is going to be hard to defend in the long term. So you do not want to play this kind of position. So just beware. If you play knight c2, don't let black play bishop takes c3. Generally speaking, it's just not going to be good.
And if black don't play knight f6 and the bishop is still threatening diagonal,
Mm-hmm.
play like knight d2, should we double the knight?
Oh, so you mean like after bishop e2, let's say I don't know, black play bishop d7?
Yeah.
You just continue improving your position and.
For example, e6. Not e6, but well, if black.
I'm glad you mentioned that, by the way. So generally speaking, if black plays bishop g7, e6 is almost always going to be batting his Maroczy bind since you would weaken d6. So just a general note there. But okay, let's say black plays something like rook c8, right? I think in these positions, I'm thinking maybe queen d2. I'm not sure. I mean, knight d2 does look fine, but I'm thinking maybe just queen d2 followed by knight c3, with the idea of b3, bishop b2, develop that way. But yeah, again, knight c3 would be a huge mistake, allowing black to just permanently mess up your pawns. Knight f6, say f3, knight e5, and black is just very happy here. Okay. But anyway, typically black will play knight f6, and now you can safely play knight c3. And bishop d2 is an important move because of the following. Black wants to play knight d7, and now rook c1 and b4. This is a cool move. Now the reason we need to play b4 is if you play f3, black will actually play f5. And there's actually very decent counterplay here. So this is not what we want to allow. So b4 right away, and it is a pawn sacrifice, but you get huge compensation because of the lack of a dark squared bishop on the black king side. So this time white's pawn structure is perfect, and dark squared bishop is missing, and wow, this bishop on a1 is just on an amazing diagonal. So white's not forced winning in these kind of positions, but it's very unpleasant to play black's position. g4 just threatening g5. Now with the h file open, it's very unpleasant. And checkmate. I didn't really take time to look at all the tactics there, but you get the idea. So in this knight c2 line, got to remember that f5 kind of has some more power. So keep in mind to play bishop d2, rook c1. If black doesn't play knight d7, that's fine. You can then play f3, b3, go along the same lines. Okay. Now finally, the b5 break. So this was kind of trying to understand black's counterplay on the queen side. So I talked about f5 a little bit. So let's say you play your standard Maroczy bind. If you allow black to play b5 like he does here, it's just completely equal. Black's going to eliminate or trade some pieces, eliminate your c4 pawn. It's not going to be that great for white. So if black's ever threatening to play b5, so after like a6 he would be, then you need to play something like knight b3 here to drive away the queen, avoid exchanges, just pretty much anything to prevent black from playing b5. Right, so keep that in mind. Sometimes you want to play a4 too. So let's say, for example, black played, instead of play bishop takes, and now rook fc8. Let's say rook fc1's probably better here. So now black's threatening to play b5, right? Now we can play a4. And you can put a kind of permanent clamp on that b5 idea. So that's an important possibility to remember too.
It's really interesting. It's almost like a second bind.
Yeah.
b5 and b5.
And then just like before, other rook's probably going to go to b1 and probably aim to play b4. White would dream of something like rook a b1, b4, a5, and with a dark square clamp too. Okay, so any questions about these structures here?
In the classical Maroczy bind position,
Mm-hmm.
isn't the white square bishop weak?
Yeah. In fact, maybe it was here. Let's see, was it? I guess it was the other line. So in this case, white played f3, but you could actually play queen d2. And just like you mentioned, knight g4 isn't a problem because taking would actually be good for white. And yeah, white's light squared bishop in the Maroczy bind is actually not that valuable of a piece. Like I was saying before, it's your dark squared bishop that's your kingpin. You don't want to let go of that piece. So yeah, after like bishop takes g4, f3, white would be very happy here. Because now white has dark squared bishop, no really bad piece, and can just continue improving his position.
Yeah, that position where the knights and the bishop and the queen in that configuration is just like classic Yugoslav.
All right. So you guys have any other questions about white's plans or black's plans here? it really is important that you master these positions for white. Inevitably, you'll probably find yourself in a situation where it's just simply your best option. And the Maroczy bind doesn't only crop up against the Sicilian, by the way. There's lots of other openings it can crop up in. You can transpose that from a King's Indian or a simple dragon, anything like that. Okay. So you guys have state next week, right?
Yeah.
So you guys feel ready?
Rating.
I've seen some people shaking some rough stuff recently.
Well, that's good.
Not gonna name names.
Yeah, I would definitely suggest you, just like we've mentioned before, iron out your opening repertoire, play a bunch of blitz games online, get out those blunders and wrinkles in your repertoire before you actually play a rated game, right? So, all right, well, I guess that was it for this.